All right, Swifters, this is Table School video number 3. What we're going to do is talk about how we can add a new view controller to hold detail information from an individual cell that we click on in a table view. We'll talk about setting up segues, the difference between a show segue and a present modally segue, and we'll create some code to cancel out of a segue and return back to the original view controller. So now we're going to set up our second view controller. That's the navigation controller that's going to hold the detail. So if we click on any individual elements, we want to be able to segue over and edit that element. Or if we click on a plus button, we want to be able to add a new element to our array, either the students array or the array of party list items. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to embed the existing view controller, the one that's got our table view, in a navigation controller. And this is going to give us the navigation bar up on top of this table view, and it'll also give us the back navigation once we set things up in our new view controller. So we head over to our main storyboard. We're going to click right here on the dock in our view controller, go under Editor, Embed in, Navigation Controller, and you'll see all of a sudden this bubbles down and we have a space up here where we can put things inside of our navigation controller. Now, even though this shows up and it looks like a view controller, we actually don't drag anything into this navigation controller here. It just acts as something that encloses this view controller and any other view controllers that are connected directly to it via segues. Now we're going to add our new view controller, and we do that in the object library by dragging a new view controller onto our main storyboard. So we'll go up in the object library, type in view controller. All of the things that show up as full view controllers on our main storyboard will have this little golden circle around it. We'll grab the view controller, drag it over here to the left, let go, and now we've got a view controller. Now we need to create a subclass of UI view controller, a Swift file that's going to hold all of the code for this view controller. So when we started things out, iOS created this view controller and it created a file called view controller Swift that's linked to this. Now that we've dragged over a new view controller, we don't have any file that's set up to control this. So that's what we're going to do now, is we're going to create a class, which is a subclass of view controller, that will allow us to add code that will control this thing that we're seeing here on our main storyboard. We do this by creating a new cocoatouch class, which is a subclass of UI view controller. We'll give it a name and save it. And then we need to use the identity inspector to click on our new file and make sure that it's selected as the new class name. Now we're going to call this student detail view controller. So let's go ahead and get this done now. So I'm going to click on view controller because it's just going to create the file right underneath it. You can either go under and say file, new file, or you could just right click here and select new file. And then we're going to subclass a cocoatouch class because the UI view controller is one of Apple's blueprints or Apple's classes. We're going to take that as a starting place, but we're just going to add our extra stuff to it. So click on next. You want to make sure that you click that you select the proper subclass in here. So this is UI view controller. Make sure that it doesn't say table view controller or anything else in there. And we're going to call this student detail view controller. So this is now the name of this file that we're creating. Click on next. Save this, and now we have this file right underneath our view controller file. Now iOS gives us some comments in here that we don't need, so I'm just going to delete those. Make sure that you don't delete any extra curly brackets in here. And all I have is a viewDidLoad function. Now I'm going to head back to main storyboard, and I'm going to make sure that this view controller that I dragged in is going to be associated with this file that I just created, the student detail view controller file. So I'm going to click on this little circle up here, the view controller circle, go up into my identity inspector. That's the one that looks like a little ID card. I think it looks like a newspaper. And then I'm going to select the class that we have in here. So by default it says UI view controller, but if we want it to be associated with this file, we need to click on class, drag down, and find the file we just created, which is student detail view controller. I'm going to press return here, and we can see now if we hover our cursor over, it says student detail view controller, and it also says that in our document outline. Mission accomplished. So we've got our file created, we've set this up so that the identity of our new view controller is this new class file that we created. So now that we have an identity set up for our new view controller, we're able to go ahead and create any IB outlets or IB actions. So let's create a text field on this view controller, and we'll call it student text field. We'll also put student name up here, but it'll just be static. We don't need to create an IB outlet because we're not going to change the student name. So a label and a text field. Here we are back over on our main storyboard. Now I'm actually going to skip ahead and I'm going to do two of the things that are listed on the next slide, because what that's going to do is it's going to make sure that we are showing our navigation controller up here and I can get a better sense of where things are laying out. So right now I don't have a navigation bar here, but we'll see that'll change. So if we're planning on using our new view controller to add new rows to our table view, then what we want to do is we want to embed our new view controller in its own navigation controller. And the reason why we're going to go ahead and do this is it will give us a space to put a save and a cancel button on our view controller. Let me just show you why we're doing this. You don't have to follow along. You can just watch the video, but if you want to try this out, you can as well. So I'm going to go over here first, and I'm going to connect this view controller to this view controller. And I'm going to add what's called a segue. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on my table view cell, and then I'm going to control drag over from the table view cell to my new view controller. Now watch what happens when I let go. First, you're going to see a space created up here because this is now considered to be part of this stack of view controllers that are all embedded in this navigation controller. So I see I've got nothing up top, but when I let go and I create what's called a show segue in here, this will slide it over to the left, and now I see I've got a back button in here. Now this will work fine if all I want to do is just click and see different elements from our table view. But if you want to add elements to your array that's showing up inside of your table view, then you're going to add a plus button up here. And what that does, typically according to Apple's interface guidelines, is it bubbles a view controller up from the bottom. First, let's see what's happening here when things are embedded in this stack of view controllers that's all associated with this navigation controller. So I'll build and run. And now watch what happens when I click on one of the names. We're not passing over any data yet, but we will perform this segue. And a show segue, like we selected here, will just slide this guy over, but it's still on the stack of view controllers that are all embedded in the navigation controller. You see how we slid over? So now we're on this. We have a back button which is added automatically. And when I click on back, I pop this off of the stack of view controllers here, and I head back over here. Now the behavior that we're taking a look at, where we slide something in from the side when you click on it, is the exact behavior that Apple wants you to be seeing when you use apps. So if we get into, for example, the Contacts app and see how this behaves, well, I could click on somebody like Johnny Appleseed here and notice it slides over from the side. Well, this is that exact behavior. This is the show segue that I'm seeing. Now look what's going to be different here. If I click on the plus button up here, I'm not going to show segue over. Instead, I'm going to bubble up from the bottom, and that's going to show a view controller which is placed on top of this. You'll actually be able to see by taking a look at the top of the view controller here. You see how there's a little gap? So this is laying right on top of the other view controllers. This is the behavior that Apple wants. Now I'm going to click on cancel here, and I'm going to show you what would happen if we went ahead and added a plus button here and then went to this view controller via a segue. So I'm going to click on this view controller here, click on plus. The things that you add in the navigation controller are called bar button items. So I'll grab the bar button item over here, put this over here on the right hand side. I'm going to set this bar button item type to add. It'll give me a little what looks like a plus sign in there, but it's actually a special character which is an elongated plus sign, so it's not the character plus. So my system item will be add. Then I'm going to control drag and watch what happens if I don't add the navigation controller. If I just control drag from here to here and select what's called present modally. Now present modally will bubble the view controller up from the bottom, and we can see how the view controller changes here. So if I click on this view controller, this is the show segue. But if I click on this segue here, it shows it's bubbling up from the bottom because you can see the interface change a little bit. It's kind of having the one view controller lie on top of the other view controller. So watch what happens when I stop and run. If I click an element here, this is my show segue going over, and I get my navigation controller. However, I click on plus, I bubble up from the bottom, which is great, but I don't have any buttons up here. And since I'm going to be adding a new record, I'm going to want show and cancel to show, or cancel and save to show up here. In fact, I'm going to want cancel and save to show up for this segue as well. So how do I make sure that I can add not only a save, a cancel and a save here, but also a cancel and a save here? Well, what I've got to do is I've got to embed this view controller in its own navigation controller. And when I come in from the plus button, I've got to go up to the navigation controller and then back down into the view controller, and that will give me this area up top where I can add my cancel and my save button. If I don't do that, I get this blank screen here, and I've got no space for my save and cancel. By the way, you can also, in the new version of iOS, drag to dismiss. You may or may not want to keep that feature in there. I'll show you how you can deal with that in just a bit. But first, let's get back to our navigation controller. So I'm going to delete this top segue. This is I can just verify which segue it is by taking a look in the attributes inspector. Yeah, this is my present modally one. Present modally bubbles up from the bottom. So with this segue selected, that's this top one. It turns blue. It says present modally. I'm going to backspace over it. I'm actually going to end up backspacing over this one, but I'll show you what happens first if I don't do it. So I'm going to click on this view controller here, and I'm going to embed it in its own view controller. So if I say editor and then embed in and then navigation controller, this embeds this in a navigation controller going straight through, and that's actually not what I want. I want this segue to go directly into this view controller. So I'll just delete this by clicking on this particular segue, backspacing, moving this up, and then I'm going to have two segues. One segue is going to go from clicking on the table view cell, so I'm going to control drag from this over into my new view controller, let go. This is the show segue, so I'll click on show. This is the one which will keep it inside of this navigation controller and slide things in from the left. It will give me this space up top, but I am going to change this so that I get a cancel and a save button up top here. Now I also want to click here on the segue and give it an identifier. Now identifiers are typically used in code when we need to confirm what we're dealing with on our user interface. So remember, we had an identifier for our cell here. Well, to be able to identify this segue versus the other segue we're about to write from the plus sign, we want to give them an identifier. So I'll click on this segue right here. It's blue. I'm in the circle piece. I'm going to go up under identifier, which is storyboard segue, in my attributes inspector, and I'm going to say show detail, upper camel case. Press enter. Now for my plus, I'm going to click on this bar button item here, the add bar button item, control drag up to the navigation controller. Not this guy, but this guy. Let go. It's going to be present modally, so I'm going to click on this. I can click right on this segue now, the present modally segue that I just added. I can see it indeed says this is the present modally segue. It's the storyboard segue, and I'm going to give this the identifier add detail and press enter. So if I click on this segue, its identifier show detail. If I click on this segue, its identifier is add detail. Now that I've created both of these segues and I've got the space in here, I can see how the space changes slightly if I click on this segue here. Actually, I guess I've got to click on this segue here, which we normally don't deal with at all, but this will show you how things will look if you are coming in here from the add button using the present modally segue. So what I'm going to do in here is I'm going to add a field, a label that says student name, and then a text field underneath it. So I'll click on plus, drag over this label, let go. I'll also click on plus, and I'll grab a text field and bring that over too. Make things a little bit larger. I'll name this one student name with a colon, drag it over here to the left. And just to make it look like the previous slide, I'll change the font to custom. Avenir next, condensed, bold, '24, and I'll change the color to Boston College Maroon. And then for the text field in here, I'll drag this from margin to margin. And I'll increase this font also to 24. I'll put in some text just to make sure that it's resized okay. This looks fine. So I'll get rid of the text that I had in there. And if I want to make sure that things resize as well, this should be set up default for auto resizing in the upper left-hand corner, which is exactly what I want. This guy here I want to resize though. So I'm going to click on both the left and the right as well as the top, and I'm going to click on the inside line, and that will resize things horizontally. So if I go back down to a smaller iOS device, I notice that I've been designing on my iPhone 11 here. But if I go down to an SE, things shrink. And if I go up to an iPhone that's the Max model, things expand. So this is looking good. Now that I've got this created, let me go ahead and create an IB outlet for my student name field. So I'm going to click on my student detail view controller and then option click on my main storyboard. So remember, I'm going to grab this element inside this view controller and I'm going to add it to my student detail view controller so that I can refer to this text field in my code. Control drag over, let go. I'm going to call this student text field. Click connect. The connection's made. Now I can get rid of my main storyboard. So now at this point, if you've been following along our slides, we've gone through all of these different stages here where we've embedded our first view controller in its own navigation controller. We've added a second view controller. We've created a Swift file for that second view controller. We set the identity inspector for that second view controller so that it's now identified to the Swift file that we just created for it. Since we are going to be adding new elements to our array, we want to make sure that we can create the add effect where we bubble up a view controller from the bottom. That's the present modally segue. And in order to do that, we need to make sure that we've got a view controller for when we add a view controller on top instead of being part of the embedded view controller stack. So we added a bar button item. We did our present modally segue from this. We added a segue directly from our table view cell to our new view controller. We didn't go through the navigation controller for this. This is a show segue. At this point, this is how our main storyboard should look. And in fact, it does. There's a chance that you might have this, positioned just a little bit differently, but the line should line up properly. Again, we click on this segue and look in the attributes inspector. We can see it's our show detail segue and it's a show. If we click on this segue, we can see it's an add detail and it's a present modally. Now we need to add a save and cancel button to our detail view controller, and we want to add an IB action to perform a cancel if it's clicked on. Now the way that we're going to do that is in the object library. We're going to drag over the back that you see currently on this new view controller and replace it with a cancel button. Over here on the right-hand side, we'll add a bar button item for save. Those should both be set to cancel and save as system item options. Now, one thing that you want to be aware of, and again, always read the notes on the slides here, if we were to go ahead and change the title programmatically, then we'd want to make sure that we didn't set these to system items, but we instead set them to custom. We're going to see that we're going to have to do this when we set up our edit button on the view controller that shows our table view, but for these ones, we don't have to worry about setting to custom. We want to go ahead and use the system item setting. Then we'll create an IB action for the cancel button and only for the cancel button, and we'll call that cancel bar button pressed. So here we are back on our main storyboard. I'm going to add two bar button items. First bar button item is going to go over here on the left-hand side. This is currently set to custom. I want it to be set to one of the system items, which is going to be cancel. It changes to cancel. Then I'm going to click on the object library again, drag over a new bar button item to the right. I'm going to change this to save. Both of these are set up. Now I need an IB action and just an IB action for my cancel button. So I'm going to click on Student Detail View Controller, Option click on Main Storyboard, then Control drag for my cancel bar button item underneath View Did Load just before the closing curly. I'm going to call this Cancel Button Pressed. I'm going to make sure that this says UI bar button item and click Connect. Now that this is all set up, and we want this to be cancel button pressed. Now that this is all set up, we're going to enter some code in cancel button pressed. I typically underline things that need to change from code example from project to project in green. Nothing is highlighted in green here, which means the same code can be used over and over again. Now there are a bunch of different ways to handle dealing with the cancel button, but I like this little chunk of code in here because regardless of whether something is presented via a save or via a cancel, this will go ahead and run the proper code to cancel me out of this view controller. Now I'll describe this code after I type it in, but let's go ahead and enter this in, and we'll have a nice chunk of code that we can use as a software Lego whenever we need some code for a cancel button. So I'm going to get out of main storyboard, and the first line I'm going to write inside of my cancel bar button is I'm going to create a constant. It's going to be called let is presenting in add mode. I'm going to write the code and then I'll describe what this does in just a bit. And I'll say presenting view controller, and you want to make sure that you select the presenting view controller. This is the view controller that presented the current view controller. And then I want to see what kind of view controller this is. So I'll say is UI navigation controller. Now, if this is the case, then what must have happened is the presenting view controller came from a navigation controller, which must have meant I pressed on the plus button. Now, the reason why this is important is there's not a single way that you can cancel and go back to the previous view controller. Programmatically, to handle this in iOS, if you come in from a navigation controller, what you've got to do is use a command called dismiss. But if you come in from the stack of view controllers that's embedded in a navigation controller way back here, then what you do is you pop off of this navigation controller's stack. So what we're going to do is first see, hey, what was the presenting view controller for this view controller? If it was a navigation controller, that meant that the previous view controller was this guy up here. This is how we got to our current view controller. Then we dismiss. But if that's not true, then we must have come in this way, which means we can go ahead and pop. So this is the code we'll write for that. Is just checks the type to see if the presenting view controller, which is a built-in iOS data structure, it's a built-in iOS value, if it's a UI navigation controller, if the type is this, then this is going to be either true or false. That's what is gives us. So we'll say down here, if is presenting in add mode, we'll say dismiss, and we'll say animated is true, and the completion handler is nil. Otherwise, we must have come directly in from this view controller, and that means we have to pop this view controller off of the stack of view controllers. Now what we type in here looks a little weird because we've got to refer back to the earlier navigation controller. But what we'll say is navigation controller, and then we'll say dot, and we'll say pop view controller, and the animated will be true here. So now, if we go ahead and build and run, we should see the cancel button works perfectly. So if I click on one of these guys and segue over, cancel, that's what a pop looks like, slides me back over. If I click here, I'm doing my present modally, a cancel here. What does a dismiss look like? It slides it down below. Up, dismiss, show, pop. Present modally, dismiss, show, pop. Perfect! Now it's your turn to give this a try. So now you have to apply what you know in PartyPlanner to do what we just did together in our student list. So you want to update the PartyPlanner from where we finished off our last exercise. You want to embed the existing view controller in a navigation controller. You want to add a second view controller to display the party item and the person responsible. You also want to embed this new view controller in its own navigation controller. You want to create a Swift file for the new view controller. Why don't you call this detail view controller? Make sure that you set the identity of your new view controller to detail viewcontroller.swift. create a show segue going directly from the table view cell to the new detail view controller that triggers when the user clicks on the cell. Set the identifier for this segue to show detail. Add a plus bar button item to the upper right corner of the view controller containing the table view. When clicked, that plus button should trigger a present modally segue that is arrived at via the navigation controller that you embedded your new view controller in. Give this the identifier add detail. Modify the interface for the detail view controller to include a cancel bar button item in the upper left-hand corner. Add an IB action for it that says cancel button pressed. Write code to handle the cancel. And also make sure that you set this up so that you've got two static labels in here, one that says party item, the other that says person responsible, and that you also have two text fields in here for holding the party item and the person responsible. Pause, give it a shot, and we'll give the solution in the next video.